Guys, it's Monday night and I am sitting down to discuss Charles Martin versus Anthony Joshua in a bit more detail. Just been out on a run, got rained on, so apologies if I'm looking rather damp. I'm afraid you'll just have to put up with it if you want to hear the thoughts on Charles Martin versus Anthony Joshua. You may or may not have seen, I did a very short video yesterday just announcing the news on the channel. Yesterday was Valentine's Day and I was spending the evening with my young lady, so couldn't really talk at too much length. So this is going to be my sort of in-depth rambling video following on from the announcement. So if you're not a fan of the long-winded rambling videos, you're probably best to tune off now, because I've settled in. I've poured myself a nice pint. I'm on the Guinness tonight, and I'm getting ready to talk to you all about Anthony Joshua versus Charles Martin. Let me start by addressing one or two of the comments that have come up on previous vids where I've talked about this fight and talked about whether it should or shouldn't happen. You know, I'm not going to go over my points of view again, because if you want to see those are still available on YouTube and I don't need to reiterate them. But it's certainly fair to say I was quite strongly opposed to this fight from the perspective of Anthony Joshua's well-being and growth. And I didn't think it was the right time for him to take this fight. I feel he should have had more learning fights. I absolutely stand by that. Absolutely stand by that. And I'm not going to change my mind on that, no matter what the result is of this fight. And one person commented in the comment section, they said, how can you say you won't change your mind on this being the wrong time if Anthony Joshua goes out there, destroys Charles Martin and becomes a world champion? The answer to that is because you have to make your decisions based on the facts that are in front of you at this time. Now look, if I told you the favourite is going to win the next race at Newmarket, you should put your life savings on it, and you went and put your life savings on it, risked your mortgage, risked your money to feed your kids, that's the wrong decision. You know, based on the facts that you have available to you at the time, some guy on the internet you've never met before has said the favourite is going to win in the next at Newmarket, put your life savings on it, that is the wrong decision. For me, that decision remains wrong, regardless of whether the horse wins or loses. Sure, if it wins, it's a happy coincidence, and you've done alright for yourself financially, as is the case with Anthony Joshua, Charles Martin. But for me, based on what we know at the time, based on the 15 previous fights that Anthony Joshua has had, based on some of the experiences he has had in the ring, where he's looked flawed against opponents, and based, more importantly, on some of the experience that he hasn't had in the ring, fighting a southpaw, going 12 rounds, this is too early for him. That's my opinion. And I think even if he is to win the fight, it's the wrong decision. I think for his long-term career longevity, long-term earning potential, and longevity as a world champion, it would have been better for him if he'd had a few more learning fights building up to this. I think he would have a greater chance of winning this fight if he'd had 3 or 4 more build-up fights. But look, that's just my thoughts on this. The same could be said for Charles Martin. I do think there's some truth in the fact that Charles Martin may be catching Anthony Joshua at the right time, catching Joshua before he's had his learning fights and before he's fully experienced and developed. But you could say, despite the fact that Charles Martin is world champion, supposedly, let's put that to one side, these guys are actually at a similar level. You know, Charles Martin's got the best win out of both of them. You know, doesn't matter about the manner of victory. You know, Martin went out, performed in a world title fight with the lights on, with all the pressure, and boxed well and was victorious in that fight. You know, for me, it doesn't overly matter about the context of the win. You know, Martin has proved he could keep his cool and perform under that sort of pressure. Apart from that marquee performance, if you like, for want of a better term, the level of form, you could say Joshua's resume, apart from the Glasgow fight, is actually stronger. You know, they're not at a dissimilar level, Martin's had more fights. Martin's been in a world title fight, obviously, but they're not at a completely dissimilar level. And you could argue that whilst Joshua's untested, as is Charles Martin, as is Charles Martin. And, certainly there's some merit to that. Charles Martin has had more fights. He has gone later in fights, which I think is very good for his development. But yeah, he hasn't had the fights against the established competition, the Cams, the Tony Thompsons. Neither has Joshua. So they're in the same page in that sense, for my money. And I am surprised that Charles Martin's taken this fight. I really am surprised. With Al Heyman in his corner, I'd have just thought he'd have gone one of two ways. He'd have fought an easy voluntary, someone like a Dominic Breazeale, someone like a Tony Thompson, someone like a Malik Scott. I'd have thought he'd fight an easy voluntary to get some proper experience, or I'd have thought he'd have taken a huge money fight in a unification against the Deontay Wilder. I thought that fight was likely. I'm surprised that Al Heyman wants to give up the belt to a fighter in Anthony Joshua who's outside his stable. The fact that Martin's taken this fight shows real credit and guts from him. For his first title defence, he's going to come over to the UK in a fight where the opponent is going to be a massive betting favourite. He's going to fight in their hometown, in front of their home fans, in a fight Martin won't be expected to win. So massive credit to him. It's a strange fight for him to take, though. I assume he's getting paid very, very well. I don't have any idea, but I guess he must be getting paid somewhere between $2 to $4 million for this fight. Obviously Eddie Hearn broadcasting how much Joshua and Dillian Whyte earned in their fight has generated interest from overseas. But for me, I'm still slightly, I can't quite work out why Al Heyman has allowed him to do this. I'd have thought Al would have wanted to have hold the belts hostage, unless they are thinking that now may be the time to catch Anthony Joshua. Maybe they are thinking, look, Joshua's going to be the mandatory challenger anyway. Would it be sensible to get him before he's had the fight against Khan, before he's had the fight against Joseph Parker, get him when he's slightly younger in his career? Maybe that's what they're thinking, and the fact that there's such a big payday in it with the UK pay-per-view money and UK ticket sales is making it more likely. But, regardless, fair play to Anthony Joshua for getting himself in this position, fair play for Eddie Hearn for building him into a position where he can bring over world champions, and fair play to Charles Martin for having the balls to take the fight. Credit to all involved. If I was managing Anthony Joshua, it wouldn't be the route I'd go down. I've made that clear. I think he needs more experience. But, there you are. Look, I said on several videos that I didn't think Joshua would win a world title in 2016. I said that he would win a world, if he was going to win a world title, 2017 would be more realistic. And, quite a few people have been at pains to point that out in the comment section. And, yeah, fair play to you. A large portion of the reason why I said he wouldn't win a world title in 2016 is because I didn't think he'd get a world title fight in 2016. But who could have predicted the chain of events? Fury beats Klitschko. Klitschko exercises rematch clause. As a result, the IBF inexplicably strips Tyson Fury within 1 week of him winning the world title. Charles Martin versus Glazkov is made for the IBF title. Two relatively unheard of fighters. And somehow it's turned round at lightning speed. And they're fighting in January for the title that Tyson Fury won in November. Inexplicably, Anthony Joshua is rated at the top of the IBF rankings and would have got a mandatory anyway. That chain of events I didn't predict, I couldn't predict, I wouldn't predict again. But that's why boxing is an amazing sport, and that's why it keeps us all on our toes, because I did get that one wrong, and certain people did call it right. They said he would get a world title shot in 2016, but I didn't see anyone predict the way it happened, For me, that was the real confusing anomaly there. Right. So, from my mind, sorry, that's quite disturbing for you guys. So for my money, it's the wrong fight for Anthony Joshua. There's also an argument it's the wrong fight for Charles Martin, but maybe Charles Martin's handlers don't rate him and want to cash him out with the biggest possible paycheck. Maybe they think Anthony Joshua's being caught at the right stage of his career. So then, there might be things going on in the Charles Martin camp we don't know about. But here we are anyway. We're at the point of the fight, and a lot of people are making Anthony Joshua a very, very heavy favourite for this fight. Some early lines I've seen with the bookmakers have Anthony Joshua 1-7 on, and Charles Martin 5-1 against. Now, regardless of who I end up picking in this fight, and we'll get to that in a minute, those odds in my book are wrong. The bookmakers' odds obviously are clearly largely determined by public perception, the weight of public opinion, and the resulting public finances that follow. But regardless, for me, those lines are too wide. Guy like Anthony Joshua, never been 12 rounds, never been 8 rounds, stepped up to British title level, at best showed defensive frailties, stamina concerns, punch resistance concerns, at least to the body. For me, when you've got those concerns about you, stepping straight from a British title fight to a world title fight, in your first match against the Southpaw, you're not 1-7 on, And that's not saying that Anthony Joshua doesn't deserve to win the fight. It's not saying he won't win the fight. It's saying that he shouldn't be priced at 1-7. Mathematically, I just feel that that's wrong and can potentially be exploited. A lot of people are giving me similar reasons as to why Charles Martin is going to lose this fight. Let me touch on 3 of the main reasons people are saying Charles Martin's going to lose this fight. Firstly, and this is the one that I find the most absurd, look at how he performed against Zumbano Love. He laboured to a 10th round knockout, whereas Anthony Joshua knocked out Zumbano Love in 2 rounds, or something like that. Now let me address that directly. Anthony Joshua looked very impressive against Zumbano Love. It was one of his better performances, actually. I gave him a lot of praise for that performance. Zumbano Love was actually quite a durable guy in terms of his record, and Joshua flattened him. Now, what I've got to say is Charles Martin going 10 rounds against Zumbano Love and grinding out a stoppage there, for me, arguably, was a more beneficial fight, beneficial learning performance for him than what Anthony Joshua learned from fighting Zumbano Love. And let me tell you, having watched that fight, I'm not one of these people who's just seen Charles Martin went 10 rounds with Zumbano Love. I was able to track down the footage and watch it. I don't know if it's still on YouTube, so I'm thinking of this from memory from time ago. But I watched the fight and I was actually quite impressed with how Charles Martin did against Zumbano Love. It was a very one-sided fight. Zumbano Love, clearly he's not the best fighter out there. He's not anywhere near the best fighter out there, let me rephrase that. But Charles Martin, as expected, completely dominated him, won every round. And I thought Charles Martin really, really put the foot to the gas and put the pressure on to stop him and to get him out of there in the last round. Charles Martin really impressed me. He sort of showed an immense work ethic. And for me, this is especially important if you consider that Charles Martin isn't the kind of six-pack Terminator bodybuilder style physique. He showed excellent conditioning and stamina in this fight. He was forcing the pace on Zumbano Love, throwing bomb after bomb after bomb into the 10th round of that fight. And that is the main image that sticks with me from that Zumbano Love fight, was Charles Martin putting him into the corner, throwing artillery, bombs, and eventually grinding him down, wearing him out and stopping him in that fight. You know, wearing him out and stopping him in that fight. You know, Joshua's performance was more clinical. Joshua hit him with a single punch, and I remember it was arguably the second best punch Joshua has ever thrown in his pro career. The first being that uppercut he landed on Dillian Whyte. But it was a beautiful one-punch knockout Joshua scored over Zambano. And clearly it was a more visually spectacular knockout. But I got to say, Martin probably learnt more from his fight against Zambano. And Martin probably proved more in his fight against Zambano. We know if this fight goes to the 10th round, Charles Martin has proven, even if it's at a lower level of opposition, that he can still be in there, thinking, picking the right shots, forcing the pace, and throwing quite high volume power punches. Do we know that about Anthony Joshua? You know, for me, he looked low on stamina. Look, Joshua's clearly a very fit guy. He's clearly a very fit guy. Just look at him. But he's so muscle bound. And for me, when Whyte had success hitting him to the body, I think that was in the second round of their fight, he became extremely low volume, both in that second round and in the third round that followed. You know, Joshua wasn't in there throwing haymakers and keeping the punch output so high. Whereas Charles Martin really was in the fight against Zambano, and that impressed me. You know, it's old sort of styles make fights triangle theory here, but the fact that Joshua took out Zambano in 2 rounds, whereas Charles Martin demolished him, Joshua demolished him, whereas Charles Martin ground him down over 10, does not equate to the fact that Joshua will destroy Charles Martin. You know, Charles Martin may be a slower paced fighter. He may be more of a 12-round fighter than a one-punch knockout artist. And these are not negatives. So I think people are foolish just to look on BoxRec, see they've got an opponent in common, and you know, judge them differently off the back of that. For my money, anyway. The second one I get is, you know, Joshua's proved himself against Dillian Whyte. Dillian Whyte's a good fighter. What has Charles Martin ever done to prove he's better than Dillian Whyte? Well, firstly, I do genuinely believe Charles Martin is better than Dillian Whyte. You know, Glazkov, whether you like Glazkov or not, is a class boxer. He's an amateur Olympic medalist. You know, he's known as a classy amateur boxer, excellent jab. And for me, Charles Martin was soundly outboxing him, even if it was only over 3 rounds before the fight got stopped. You know, Dillian Whyte, when he fought Joshua, his punches were wide, his jab wasn't very snappy, you know, his defence was very loose. For me, Charles Martin is clearly a better boxer than Dillian Whyte at this stage. But it's also not about whether he's better than Dillian Whyte. It's about the fact that Charles Martin is bringing things to the table that Joshua hasn't seen before. You know, Joshua's never been in with a southpaw. You know, Joshua probably has never been in with someone with the power of Charles Martin. Maybe Dillian Whyte hits as hard as Charles Martin, I don't know. But even if Joshua's been in there once with someone with the same power, he hasn't been in there much with someone with the same power. And I actually think Charles Martin's got more punch variety than Dillian Whyte. You know, I've watched a lot of old Charles Martin fights. Long-time subscribers will know I've been watching Charles Martin and doing videos on Charles Martin for, I don't know, 18, 24 months before he won a world title. You know, he's someone I've been watching for a long time. Charles Martin is someone who can mix it up on the inside a bit. Charles Martin is someone who can punch to the body a bit. Charles Martin is someone who can throw combinations of punches and change levels, go from head to body. And he hits hard. You know, he may not hit as hard as Anthony Joshua. He may not hit as hard as Deontay Wilder, but Charles Martin carries power. So not only is he a southpaw, not only does he probably have the best punch variety Joshua's been in with, not only can he hit to the body and fight in close as well as at range, he's also the first proper big guy that Joshua's been in with. Look, I'm not counting Gary Cornish. That fight was so quickly over. that I don't think Joshua learned anything from it. This is the first time really he's going to face a big guy, because when a fight lasts 10 seconds, it doesn't teach the fighter anything. So Charles Martin may or may not be better than Dillian Whyte. I think he is. You may think he's not. But at least accept Charles Martin's very different to Dillian Whyte. Very, very different to Dillian Whyte. I sat down the week after and re-watched Anthony Joshua Dillian Whyte, and bizarrely I watched it with a female relative of mine who'd never seen boxing before, and she said something to the effect of, don't they have weight classes in boxing? Dillian Whyte is so much smaller than Anthony Joshua. Now look, I was at the weigh-in, I understand how these things work, I know they're the same size in terms of weight, but visually Anthony Joshua did look massive compared to Dillian Whyte, because the way they were fighting, exchanging from range, in the early rounds at least, Joshua's height, Joshua's range was the dominant factor. He's not going to have that against Charles Martin. Charles Martin's going to be different in that sense. He's going to be a very, very different challenge to Dillian Whyte. A lot longer. He's going to be a much more similar size to Anthony Joshua. You've got a southpaw stance, which is a very unknown characteristic for Joshua to face, that it's famous for catching a lot of guys out. You've got the fact that Martin can hit to the body, which potentially is vulnerable for Joshua. There's a lot there. Charles Martin, most importantly, is a thinking fighter. You see him go out against Glazkov, the biggest fight of his life, and in the first minute of the first round, Glazkov starts quickly, but Charles Martin remains calm. He doesn't let the pressure get to him. He has a look, he has a think. He's a real thinking man's fighter. He can counterpunch. You see Charles Martin looking for gaps and trying to find them and setting traps. He is a far more sophisticated boxer than Dillian Whyte. He's a very, very different opponent, Dillian Whyte. Size-wise, the stance, the punch variety, the whole way he approaches the fight. Much more thinking, more tactical for me. Some of these reasons that people are saying why this is a mismatch, I disagree with. The Zambano love thing is the main one I get. I disagree with that. The fact that Charles Martin is no more proven than Dillian Whyte, well, he may not be more proven, but he's very different. Finally, a lot of people say about how slow Charles Martin is. A lot of people say, oh, look at Charles Martin, he's so slow on his feet, how he moves around the ring. And what I would say is Charles Martin clearly isn't the athlete that Anthony Joshua is naturally. Anthony Joshua would beat Charles Martin in a 100-metre sprint. Anthony Joshua would beat Charles Martin in a javelin competition or in a triple jump competition. Charles Martin probably isn't the athlete. But Glazkov is a A-star boxer, as I say, Olympic amateur pedigree. And despite the fact that Glazkov seemingly had a massive speed and pace advantage and agility advantage, as well as a massive boxing pedigree advantage, why was it that Charles Martin was able to outbox him over the 3 rounds? And that's not just me saying it. At the time of the stoppage, all the judges had him ahead, I think. Or at least 2 of the 3 judges had him ahead. For me, I look at that fight, and I actually re-watched that fight, Martin Glazkov, before making this video. And Charles Martin was actually making Glazkov miss early on. There was 1 or 2 times you saw Glazkov miss widely. Why would the A-grade boxer Glazkov miss widely against the slow, lumbering Charles Martin? Well, for me, it was because Charles Martin had excellent judgment of range. Excellent judgment of range. And I think this Charles Martin being slow could possibly be overstated. I mean, sure, Anthony Joshua could get all over him in the first minute of the first round, and Joshua does seem like a force of nature in the first round. It's when he's most dangerous, like Luis Ortiz almost. And you can't rule out the early stoppage because Martin is unknown and untested himself. But for me, Joshua is a fighter who's extremely reliant on range. He's not a fighter who really likes it up close. He's not a fighter who really likes it if a fighter's staying outside of his jab. He likes to stay sort of in the pocket at that nice, I call it 3/4 range, where he can get his work off, his long 1-2, and his opponent will be standing in front of him, preferably with his back against the ropes. I don't think Joshua is someone who is going to be absolutely elite at chasing an opponent. I don't think Joshua is going to be someone who's absolutely elite if an opponent is really up close for him and making it unpleasant. I think Joshua is at his most deadly when he can stand at that 3/4 range and tee off from range. And I think, from what I've seen, Martin, with his thinking, fighting, boxing brain, however you want to phrase it, is quite good at judging the range, and he makes adjustments to judge the range. You'll notice earlier on in the fight, Glazkov is landing with the jab. That jab starts to decrease in accuracy, even throughout the course of the first round, because Charles Martin starts to judge the range and starts to find his own range for his own shots, which are, he fights, as I say, he's someone who I don't see as reliant as range as Anthony Joshua. He's got a very, very, very long left cross. But as I say, he's also someone who can get inside. You see this in other fights and mix it up a bit, throw slightly short punches, shorten his punches up and drop to the body. So I like that about Charles Martin. In many ways, Charles Martin reminds me of Tony Thompson. And as I've said time and time again, Anthony Joshua reminds me very much of David Price. But if you look at Charles Martin and Tony Thompson, there are similarities there, aren't they? I think they're both 6'5". They're both southpaws. They've both got very, very high knockout ratios, despite the fact they don't look like concussive one-punch fighters. And most importantly, they're both guys who come out, have a look at their opponent, start quite slowly. Neither of them are hugely natural athletes. They both come out, they're standing there, making it awkward, southpaw stance, pumping a bit of a slow jab, having a look, trying to work out the angles. I see a lot of similarities there. And guys like Tony Thompson, guys who really think and work out the puzzle that is grade A elite boxing, can potentially prove to be the kryptonite for the untested fighter who relies more on athleticism and power than true class boxing. Tony Thompson was the kryptonite for David Price. Look, clearly Anthony Joshua looks a lot better than David Price. And clearly Tony Thompson is a more tested fighter than Charles Martin. What I'm saying is people who, and I'm not even saying I'm picking Charles Martin to win here, but this is a competitive fight. Make no mistake about it. This is a real competitive fight. And people who dismiss, those are the three reasons I've got. Charles Martin is so slow. I quite like the fact that he goes out and has a look and is a bit more of a thinking fighter rather than a pure athlete. Charles Martin took 10 rounds to get rid of Zambano Love. Good. He proved he could go the distance. He proved he could keep punch volume and stamina up in the last round. Charles Martin doesn't have a better win than Dillian Whyte. Good. He's a very different fighter to Dillian Whyte. All of these reasons why it's not competitive, I completely disagree with in the strongest possible terms. What I'm saying is this is different test for Anthony Joshua. But who are the best three fighters that Anthony Joshua's beaten? Seriously, who are the best three fighters that Anthony Joshua has beaten? Comment it below. Dillian Whyte, Kevin Johnson. Who? Who is the third? Denis Baktov? Konstantin Eretz? Gary Cornish? It's hardly a murderer's row, is it? My point is, when your three best victories on your resume include the name Gary Cornish, and the biggest fight of your life is for the British title, to be stepping up to fight for a world belt in your 15th fight against the first southpaw you've ever faced. He's a thinking man's fighter. And is a big, awkward guy who judges range very well. It's no easy task. Anthony Joshua will be favourite for this fight. And possibly rightly so. But for those of you thinking that this is not competitive or this is a walkover, I strongly suggest you think again. I think you've got this one badly wrong. Badly wrong. Look, at the end of the day, I could make a video here and I could say Anthony Joshua is a force of nature. He's the best thing since sliced bread. He'll come out and knock Charles Martin out in the first round. But the truth is, I like to look at fights in a bit more detail, and I like to have a discussion about boxing. And for me, having a discussion about boxing is more interesting if you're considering an opinion that maybe doesn't line up with public perception. I don't come on here and make predictions when a fighter is 1-7 on, because that's not interesting. That's not necessary. I'm not contributing or adding anything. I like to look at angles in a fight as to, is there something that the public could have missed? Now look, Charles Martin, there are questions about Anthony Joshua. There are certainly questions about Charles Martin. We've already discussed he isn't the most natural athlete. We've already discussed he doesn't have the best foot speed. We've already discussed he doesn't have the best resume. You know, let's throw a few more out there. He doesn't have the best hand speed either. His chin, it's untested really, isn't it? You know, it's untested. He's quite upright. He's quite upright. You know, defensively I have concerns about him. He stands upright, like Anthony Joshua, limited head movement. Despite the fact he's so up in the air, he doesn't keep his hands as high as I'd like. Often you see them more here than here. Despite the fact he's not keeping his hands high, he's still quite hittable to the body. His chin, as I say, hugely untested. Defensively I'm unsure. And he's not the most athletic, snappiest, fastest guy in the world. Joshua could hit him. Joshua could hurt him. We may find out Charles Martin's chin turns to glass when he's in there with a guy like Anthony Joshua. I'm not saying Charles Martin is a safe bet. I'm not saying he's a sure thing in this fight at all. Don't get me wrong. There are just as many questions about Charles Martin as there are Anthony Joshua. And there's a lot of unknowns and intangibles about Charles Martin from his fights so far. You know, I look at his unknowns and sure, he can be hit to the body. I'm not really seeing Joshua as a lethal body puncher. You know, Joshua's clearly got power to the head. Charles Martin's going to have to work on keeping his hands high. But I think if he can judge the range well and try and be a bit shrewd with his southpaw stance, he's got a decent chance of negating some of Joshua's work to the head. And with the fact that he does come out quite slowly and he does have a look at his opponent, you know, if Joshua gasses in this fight, I'm confident Charles Martin will still be throwing punches in the 10th round. I'm also confident with Charles Martin's power, he won't let Anthony Joshua off the hook like I believe Dillian Whyte did in the second round. You know, Joshua may be a very good fighter. Dillian Whyte may be a much better fighter than Charles Martin. Maybe we'll know in 5-10 years time, who knows. But as I say, at this stage, this is far from a certainty. This is absolutely far from a certainty, and I just think, you know, Joshua, he's going to have a lot of nervous energy, huge stage for him. He's a guy who comes out extremely hard and extremely fast, throws a lot of power punches, very, very muscle bound. I've not seen too much evidence that he's going to stand there and box it out with guys and jab and play a bit of chess. I just think Charles Martin does have the potential to upset him. I think Charles Martin's got the power to upset him, and I think if Charles Martin can survive the early onslaught, and believe me, that is an onslaught, Joshua is very dangerous in the early rounds. Could he drown him late? Could Charles Martin, despite the fact that he doesn't have the six-pack, could he be the one that's actually throwing more punches in the later rounds? For me, it's highly conceivable. It's highly conceivable. Who I'm going to pick, I need to have a think about that. If you put a gun to my head now and said, who would I pick? I'd pick Anthony Joshua. But I think it's a real competitive fight. A real tough fight. And it's too early for me for Anthony Joshua's career, even if he does win. Because if he does win, he's in a position where there is no going back. You know, I saw an article on Boxing Scene today with Eddie Hearn saying if they win, maybe they'll fight David Haye in the summer at Wembley. Let me tell you, Joshua shouldn't be considering David Haye for at least another year. At least another year. He is nowhere near ready for a David Haye. But if he wins this belt, the pay-per-view it's going to do, Sky aren't going to let him go back to fighting Konstantin Eriches or Gary Cornices. They're going to want the Furies. They're going to want the David Hayes. They're going to want the Deontay Wilders. And you're not going to be able to stick him on an undercard for 8 rounds at that point. You know, you've made your bed. Now you've got to lie in it. Joshua could be a real good fighter. But what Eddie Hearn is asking him to be is to be a real good fighter in his 16th fight. And if he is successful, not only in his 16th fight, but in his 17th, 18th, 19th fights, he's asking him to be a real good fighter against the southpaw when he's never faced a southpaw. It's a tough ask. Sometimes we can overanalyze boxing. Joshua hits very hard. He starts very strong. Charles Martin's untested. Joshua might blow him over like, you know, a house of cards. We shall see. But for me, there's a huge difference here between public perception and the reality. This is a close fight. Let me know your thoughts. How do you see it? You know, how do you think it plays out? I'm interested to know people's thoughts on several different areas. Does Charles Martin have the power to hurt Anthony Joshua? Who's going to be the highest stamina fighter if this goes the distance? What will Anthony Joshua do if Charles Martin judges the reins and makes him miss? How will Anthony Joshua adjust? How will AJ do against the southpaw? How will Charles Martin's chin hold up against the Anthony Joshua punch? You know, is Charles Martin too upright? Is he too easy to hit to the body? You know, let me know your thoughts. I'm keen to discuss. I think I've rambled on for long enough. It's best part of 40 minutes, so I'll try and wrap it up and call it a day there. But you know, this is why we love boxing. All these unknown questions, and we won't find out on the night. We will find out on the night, so we won't find out till the night. Let me know your thoughts. If you've enjoyed this, help support the channel by clicking the thumbs up button. Very much appreciate that. It will help me spread the word of this channel to a wider audience. Also, if you're new to the channel, if you've recently started tuning in, hit the subscribe button. I wouldn't want you to miss out all of my videos on the lead up to this fight. It's going to be a big one, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Thanks a lot for watching.